Right, thank you very much. This little session is about the works which are all in some way or another connected with Samuel Hartlib. Alas, most people have never heard of Samuel Hartlib or the Hartlib Papers, which is an immense collection of material connected with the Cromwellian period. 70 volumes of precious documents, including ones which have relevance to these books and the authorships of these books. Samuel Hartlib was a passionate publisher, but with inadequate opportunities to realise his ambitions. He was responsible for about 50 books, of which he was the editor and part publisher, and probably another 50 which have either been lost or remained unpublished. So my particular brief today is the period between 1637 and about 1649, and the particular books I've chosen to talk about are by the famous Czech reformer Comenius, Benjamin Worsley, a very little known figure, but was a very dominant one in the Hartlib network. Two young men, promising young men, John Hall and William Rand, both of whom died relatively early, but Hall, who was a prolific writer, publisher, published his first book in 1646 at the age of 19, and continued to write all manner of books, including ones which were politically explosive, as you'll see in a moment. But the first publication which Samuel Hartlib was directly responsible for was by Comenius himself. And this was a work relating to the philosophical system of Comenius, which he called Pansophia. Now, there'd been eager wait for the first expression of this philosophical scheme. It was known about throughout Europe, but little evidence of its existence. Well, the first evidence that reached publication was in the hands of Samuel Hartlib, who published this Conatum Comeniarum in Oxford in 1637. So this launched Comenius in an appropriate positive light. Like all of these books, there's a story. And the story in this case is that Hartlib had taken the liberty of publishing it without asking the permission of Comenius. Therefore, a rough draft was suddenly turned into a book published by an eminent publisher in Britain. The second part of the story is that it exposed Comenius to the accusation of Socinianism, which is now known, largely similar, Unitarianism. So, as a distinguished clergyman operating in Poland, he was under severe attack because of this suspicion. So this next story relates to the arrival simultaneously with a very important manuscript by Comenius called Didactica Magna, the Great Didactic, which is perhaps his most famous work. But the editor of this book, Joachim Hubner, took against it and said it was unsuitable for publication and should never be published. Now, Hubner controlled the publication, so he was, instead of separately organising the publication of Didactica Magna, he reluctantly, at the end of the volume, published the titles of the chapters of Didactica Magna, and was determined it wouldn't get further than that. Now, a second problem opened up, that Comenius was about to leave Poland. He couldn't get on with his work. He required suitable benefactors and supporters in another country. Britain at that time was regarded as a haven of peace, a peace that was soon to be broken, of course. It was broken on the eve of Comenius' arrival in September 1640. So he, with Pan-Sophia in his mind, arrived to an audience of benefactors and supporters who were most interested in his writings on education and the reform of language education, the general reform of improvement of education in schools, the ideas like everyone having a right of everyone, male, female, even people who were disadvantaged, to have the full-time education till the age of 25. So it was difficult to square this idea of the expectations of the benefactors with the Pan-Sophic philosophical thing that Comenius had produced. So the book was translated and put under the title Reformation of Schools, designed in two excellent treatises. A little-known book, little known at the time as well, but of course, quite understandably, because the book itself was a statement of a philosophical system and hardly anything to do with education and educational reform. Now I move on to all these books are controversial, to the Vindiciae pro religionis libertate, a classic work by Johann Krell, which is probably the best exposition of religious toleration produced at that particular period. It was immensely influential. 2 editions in the Latin, but the first translation into the vernacular was into England. Now, this was called something of a mouthful of a title, a learned and exceeding well-compiled vindication of liberty of religion, published in 1646. The translator called himself N.Y., which was an invitation to modern scholars for all kinds of baseless speculations. And I think the favoured one is that it would be by Samuel Hartlib's colleague and collaborator, John Drury. The last letters of the first name, the last letter of the... but there were plenty of other candidates who would have qualified on that basis. It's a absolutely baseless speculation, and in a way Drury would have been the last person in the world to have risked doing this. He was very keen at that point in returning from Europe to England and to becoming a member of an important member of the Westminster Assembly. It would have been suicide for him to have, even the rumour to have got around that he flirted with anything as dangerous as the work of Krell. Now I move on to John Hall, infant prodigy, self-educated man, 1 year in Cambridge, which he tired of, then London, the poetic circle of Thomas Stanley, then seeing that his future was going to be better served by going in with Samuel Hartlib, translated this work by Johann Valentin Andrea. Andrea, famous as the originator of the Rosicrucian movement, but a serious Christian idealist, and the author of numerous works. The present projected volume of his works is, I think, 13 volumes, of which this is exists in manuscript form in the Hartlib Papers. In fact, it's the only manuscript of Andrea's work in existence, as is a third manuscript, which is also included in the current volume 6 of the collected works of Andrea. Hall was commissioned by Hartlib to produce this little translation, and it is indeed a little translation in all respects, and the Oxford copy is unique. So it isn't surprising that something as minute as this was lost, but the model for the volume, and this is important, is the publication of the Rosicrucian tracts themselves, not the Rosicrucian, the Socinian tracts. The Socinian tracts were dynamite, and to be seen with these things would have been very disadvantageous to one's reputation. So they tended to publish the Socinian tracts as minute things which could be hidden in one's pocket and brought out only among immediate sympathisers. Hall was an ambitious man, and he soon moved on from the Hartlib circle into the entourage of Oliver Cromwell, where he became a letter writer for Cromwell, and used his opportunity to let his thoughts be known on issues of controversy. And one of them was the status of the universities of Oxford and Cambridge. So in 1649 he published this inflammatory pamphlet, more or less saying they had to be totally reconstructed, and that what they did at the moment was not only useless but subversive to what was needed in a progressive society. And no doubt hoped that this would be music which would be acceptable to the ears of Cromwell, which I think it was to some extent, because his next attack in 1651 was on the Royal College of Physicians and medicine as it was practiced by the medical establishment. Written, another equally inflammatory document, much longer than the earlier one, but written under the name Noah Biggs. Now, the identity of Noah Biggs has also attracted a great deal of attention, and various ideas, little supported by evidence, have been produced, but it is quite clear, and anyone who did any serious reading in the Reform literature of the time would have noticed this. The introduction to the humble notion and the Mater Medicina praxis is virtually the same. So they must be by the same author. And I've, in my book, elaborated on this and produced, I hope, evidence beyond dispute that John Hall is the writer of that particular work. Even less well known than John Hall is William Rand, an approximate contemporary, and both of them from Durham. John Hall was known as John Hall of Durham. William Rand was also known as William Rand of Durham. He had a much more conventional education and qualified as a doctor in the Netherlands, but his first love was translation. And Hartlib first wanted him to translate the biography of Peiresc, produced by a famous philosopher Gassendi, which had been published in 1641, and he was chary about doing that, so he delayed that and didn't produce it until 1657. But in the meantime, he was identified by Hartlib as the ideal person to take on, I might add, he's also Socinian. The ideal person to take on the translation of a very important work of the second phase of the Reformation by Jacobus Contius, called under the English title Satan's Stratagems, which itself was an appeal for religious tolerance. So in this respect, he's retracing the steps of Benjamin Worsley, who was probably his closest friend. It's published, so this is one half of the Satan's Stratagems, but still a book of formidable size, published in 1648 with an introduction by John Goodwin, a letter from Drury to Hartlib as introductory materials. The identity of the translator is not disclosed, again for reasons of religious opposition. So the identity of the translator has not yet been established, except in my little book, where I established very firmly that A, he was the translator of Satan's Stratagems, B, he had an advanced plan for the translation of the whole work, which was not realised, owing largely to John Drury's adverse influence, because of what we call seasonableness of time, what they call seasonableness of time. We tend to say rightness of time. Drury could always find an excuse for not undertaking things which were too polemical, and this was a huge disappointment to William Brand. So,
thank you.
That is the series.